their perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And for those who are following the text, we're up to page 284. And so, we're still, of course, in the section on emptiness, and we had, completed the section where Lama Tsongkhapa is explicitly discussing conventional truth. And then last time we met, we started on the section where he's discussing ultimate truth. And we went through the definition of an ultimate truth. And remember, one point I just want to remind people from last time, because it's going to be relevant as we go forward, is that we remember this, right? The conventional truth. Part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is doing here is he's giving definitions, but he's also talking about from which perspective, right? From what kind of mind. And so conventional truths earlier were from the perspective or from the kind of mind. How do you say it? That has an appearance of and grasps at true existence, right? Inherent existence. And then ultimate truths are from the perspective, he says here, of an uncontaminated, exalted wisdom comprehending suchness, right? A special, exalted wisdom, right? So he's saying conventional, the ultimate truth, as he's discussing it, is what that is, the emptiness perceived by that mind, right? By a non-conceptual, special, exalted wisdom of an Arya who's seen emptiness directly. So, in other words, and then so it's an Arya's wisdom of equipoise, directly realizing emptiness. And so the ultimate truth is the object realized by that kind of mind. And the last thing he had said, just because it helped transition. Oh yeah, so the last thing he had said, that Lama Tsongkhapa had said here was that of the Four Noble Truths, right, 3 are conventional truths, right? Suffering, the origination of suffering, and the path. And 1 is an ultimate truth, meaning nirvana, right? Cessation is an ultimate truth. So he had said that. And then he had made this interesting point, which was, let's remind people, because again, this is what we're going to go into in more detail now, is so that nirvana, right, we just said, is an ultimate truth, so it's an emptiness. Right? And then he said, but when somebody talks about nirvana, right, to an ordinary person, then at that time, that's not an ultimate, it's interesting, isn't it? They're talking about an ultimate truth, but that's not an ultimate truth, right? If I'm talking about nirvana, right, and we're discussing it, although the true meaning of nirvana is an ultimate truth, at that time, it's being discussed conventionally, right? And ironically, then at that time, nirvana is appearing as if it's inherently existent, right? To a mind of ignorance, because that's my mind, right? When I'm talking about that. And so he made this distinction, right? That the real meaning of ultimate truth and the real meaning of nirvana are objects of the consciousness that's a special exalted wisdom of an Arya Bodhisattva and equipoise on emptiness. But when we're reading those words, of course, then we're talking about an ultimate truth, but that's not the actual ultimate truth, isn't it? If that makes sense. So here, now he says, we're starting on the top of page 284 now where we left off. So he says, the heading says, a source for positing all phenomena by the power of designations. And I'll just read what he says. He says, therefore, everything posited as existent is posited by the power of worldly designations. Then he quotes the Sutra on the Perfection of Wisdom in 100,000 verses, which says, all these phenomena are labeled in dependence upon worldly designations. They are not the ultimate. And in Nagarjuna's 70 stanzas on emptiness, abidance, production, destruction, existence, non-existence, or low, equal, special, were taught by the Buddha by the power of worldly terms and not by the power of reality. So then Lama Tsongkhapa gives a paragraph explaining about that. So he says, In other words, all the various presentations of production, destruction, and abidance of low, supreme, and intermediate, as well as this, quote, this exists and this does not exist, that the victor, meaning the Buddha, taught, were taught as merely posited by the power of worldly designations. He said that they were not posited by the power of appreciating real abidance. That is, not posited by the power were not posited by the power of appreciating real abidance. That is not merely posited by the power of designation. And so, in part, what he's saying here is ultimate truth. Right, all of these things are conventional truths. Right? And when he says, so in other words, when they're taught as these, what's the word you say, right? Like all these worldly phenomena are discussed through the power of worldly designation. It's kind of what we got at earlier when we were talking about conventional truths, right? That they appear in a false manner, right, as if they were truly existent, and we're not seeing their ultimate mode of abidance, which is their emptiness. And one more point is that in actuality here, right, the ultimate truth, the actual way things abide, is not the purview, can't be known by worldly consciousness. Right? That can only actually be known by the exalted wisdom of an Arya and meditative equipoise. Now he says, I'll read the heading again because it's going to get further into that. Establishing as valid that something need not be truly established if it is ultimately true, because of the need to differentiate between a truth for a reasoning consciousness and a truth bearing analysis. So he quotes Master Jananagarba. Since it is the truth for an ultimate consciousness, it is an ultimate truth. Right? And so, again, he's getting further into this point I was making a few minutes ago, right? That, that's just an interesting point, right? So an ultimate consciousness, right? So he's saying ultimate truth is actually what is known by an ultimate consciousness, which means a reasoning consciousness analyzing the ultimate that finds emptiness. And not just that finds emptiness, but that finds it in a state of meditative equipoise, directly realizing it. Because there are ways of finding emptiness that are less exalted than that, right? Like, for example, a conceptual realization of emptiness. But an ultimate consciousness, right, so an ultimate truth is what is known by an ultimate consciousness. And then he says, therefore, and this is a very important paragraph, I think, so I want to go through it slowly and really talk about it a bit. He says, therefore, we assert the proposition, quote, if the ultimate were not true for an ultimate consciousness, the conventional would not be true for a conventional consciousness. I'll keep going, and then I'll go back. However, to propound that, quote, if the former were not established for the former, the latter would not be established for the latter, is to say that if the negation of a truth were not truly established, the phenomena that are the basis of the negation would be truly established. This is because an ultimate truth is posited as a mere negation of true existence, and the phenomena that are the basis of negation. Because to suggest that phenomena are not conventionally established is to suggest they are not falsely established. Thus it would be totally incoherent, because it is due to the very fact that the appearing phenomena, which do not exist in a truly established way, are not established as truly existent, that the basis of negation must be established as falsities. So here he's really teaching a very important point, which is the harmony of conventional truth and ultimate truth. And he's saying a couple different points, right? One is, like, or is it, yeah, how to say this right? Like, that to understand ultimate truth, one has to understand conventional truth. Right? And to actually understand conventional truth in a deeply correct way, one has to understand ultimate truth. And so there's a point here, I just want to go back now. So he says, we assert the following, right? If the ultimate were not true for an ultimate consciousness, the conventional would not be true for a conventional consciousness, right? So he's really getting further into a couple different points here. One is that there are these two different types of consciousness, right? There's a worldly conventional consciousness that perceives conventional phenomena, and there's an ultimate, he's calling it ultimate, right, consciousness that perceives the ultimate truth. And so I'll ask you guys, so just like to pause and think about this, right? So he's saying, if the conventional didn't appear to a conventional consciousness, then the ultimate couldn't appear to an ultimate consciousness. And if the ultimate didn't appear to an ultimate consciousness, then the conventional couldn't appear to a conventional consciousness. I just want to pause, like, that should be difficult. That's one point. Like, like I'm hoping people aren't going, oh, that's just easy. Because this is the, I mean, actually, you know, if that were easy, right, then everybody would have realized emptiness already. Does that make sense? And this is what he's getting at. That what the heart, like Lama Tsongkhapa often points this out, right? The difficult point, probably the most difficult point, is to understand the harmony of dependent origination and emptiness. You know, sometimes they say they're synonyms. They mean the same thing. Right? That's what he's getting at here. You know, but, and Lama Tsongkhapa points this out, right? That many Buddhist masters couldn't understand that harmony, right? And so, but he's now asserting it, right? Right here, where he says, if the ultimate were not true for an ultimate consciousness, the conventional would be not true for a conventional consciousness. So in the next sentence, I'll just go through it very slowly now. He says, now here he's going to give us something that's incorrect, right? He says, however, to propound that, now he's giving a wrong view here. He's saying, if the former were not established for the former, the latter would not be established for the latter, is to say that if the negation of a truth were not truly established, the phenomena that are the bases of negation would be truly established. So there he's saying, like, he's getting at this, like, there are two different issues. One is, if conventional phenomena were truly established from their own side, right, then they wouldn't be empty, right? They would be inherently existent. So the fact that they're not truly established from their own side is, you know, and it's because when you do that ultimate analysis, you can't find them, right? We've done that many times. We've gone through this text, right? So you see a conventional phenomena, right? It appears to exist from its own side. Right? That's the nature of conventional phenomena, is that we saw them truths for a concealer, right? It is one of his ways of describing what's a conventional phenomenon, right? It conceals something deeper because it appears to exist inherently from its own side. And part of what he's saying is, so first of all, if things actually existed in that way, right? Well, there are many problems, but one is, then they wouldn't be empty, right? Another is, then they would not change. They would be permanent. They would be static. They would be unchangeable, right? And non-relational, actually, right? There are many problems with that. But because things, when you search, you find they don't exist in that way, right? And that's ultimate truth, right? So so the ultimate truth is that things don't exist in the way they appear, right? When you realize exactly and precisely how things don't exist as they appear, then you realize, then that's you generate an ultimate consciousness, realizing ultimate truth, right? And because things don't exist as they appear, then they can appear in a false manner, right? Which is what conventional truth is.
You did again?
That's good, isn't it? Oh, and I'll read what he says here, right? This is an ultimate truth. This is because an ultimate truth is posited a mere negation of true existence in the phenomena of the basis of negation, right? So what he's getting at, right? So the mere negation of true existence in the phenomena that are the basis of negation, right? So a thing appears, right? And it appears as though it's truly existent, right? And in that's conventional truth, isn't it? As we've gone over that before, right? So for a conventional consciousness, right, a normal worldly consciousness, the cup appears and it appears to be truly existent. Right? And the mere negation of that true existence is ultimate truth. Right? So ultimate truth is not something, we've gone over this before, but what he's getting, first of all, it's not something separate from, right? It's not like some separate thing apart from the ultimate nature of that cup, right? And what is the ultimate nature of that cup? As he says it right here, right? He says it's the mere negation of that, of the existence of this phenomena, right? Which is the basis of negation. So the phenomena appears, the cup appears, right? It appears as truly existent. When a reasoning consciousness realizes directly that truly existing cup doesn't exist at all, right? Which is a mere negation, then that consciousness becomes, that, gives rise to an ultimate consciousness, realizing the ultimate truth, right? So it's not something separate, is it? And if and what he's getting at here is on the one hand, like if ultimate truth were some kind of truly existent thing, right? It wouldn't be the ultimate nature of the cup. Right? The ultimate nature of the cup is just a negation of the cup's existing inherently. Does that make sense?
So is there any difference between ultimate truth and dependent arising?
Is there any difference between ultimate truth and dependent arising? It's an interesting question, isn't it?
One is a synonym, seems to be a synonym of the other.
Yeah, I asked Ken Rinpoche that question, and he said they're synonyms. I'll just add a difficult point, just that I sometimes think about. So in one sense, they're synonyms, right? So you can't say they're different. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I'm just thinking about just my own side. This is just my own personal reflection. When I think about that, the difficult point for me personally with that is that the phrase "dependent arising." It's interesting, isn't it? Because emptiness is a mere negation. So you have, well, actually, Lama Tsongkhapa addresses this in his text, doesn't he? So what Lama Tsongkhapa says is the word "dependent" in dependent arising is the negation part, right? There is that when you realize that things are dependent, then that cuts off that they exist independently. So that's the mere negation. And then the arising part is the part that's addressing, but they're not completely non-existent. Right? But so anyway, yeah. So like Ken Rinpoche, and I guess Lama Tsongkhapa, when he says the word "dependent" cuts off. Lama Tsongkhapa says it right. The word "dependent" in dependent arising cuts off the possibility of true existence, or existence by its own nature, or independent existence. So in that sense, it's a synonym for emptiness.
Because I keep trying to make it something more. Like you used the phrase "ultimate truth" seems like, emptiness is seen by the ultimate yogi. So my brain's trying to make that super special, but I guess it's just that you can't go any further. It's just dependent arising.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? That's part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here, is that emptiness is not something more than that, right? He calls it a mere negation. Right? And it's not, and it's interesting. It's very strange, isn't it? Like, I mean, because and that, I'm trying to see, where does he say that? Ultimate truth or not truth? Then he says, because here he's saying we have to also remember that emptiness itself is not truly established. That's the phrase, that was for the wording he uses, right? Because that's where you're trying to make it something more, right? If you were to say it's truly established, you would be making it something more. And he's saying once you make emptiness into something truly established, that's not emptiness anymore, right? And then it's going to negate the conventional, right? Rather than be in harmony with the conventional. Because if emptiness is truly established as something, right? If emptiness is truly established here, then there was never a cup at all, right? Which is not what he's saying, right? What he's saying is, to a conventional consciousness, there is a cup, right? And the fact that that cup has no inherent existence is its ultimate truth, right? So there's not some ultimate truth, what's it say, right? That's truly established, because then it wouldn't be the nature of a cup. It would be some separate thing that's truly established. That's it. There you're getting at the harmony of the two, right? Yeah. So and so part of that is also right. If things themselves had any inherent existence, they wouldn't be empty. And if emptiness had any inherent existence, it wouldn't be the nature of those things. Right? Which implies what? The emptiness of emptiness as well. So I'm going to read the last sentence again. I'm going through the whole thing. I've been going through the whole thing slowly a couple times now. Thus, it would be totally incoherent, right? Because it is due to the very fact that the appearing phenomena, which do not exist in a truly established way, are not established as truly existent, that the basis of negation must be established as falsities, right? So what he's getting at there also is, remember, conventional truths are false, right? That was part of their definition, right? And how can you know that they're false? Because you've seen that they're empty of existing in the way they seem to exist, right? So then you know, right? They exist to a conventional consciousness, but they're false in the sense that they appear to be truly existent, but they're not. They don't exist in the way in which they appear, right? They're not false in the sense they have no existence at all, right? They're false in the sense that they don't exist in the manner in which they appear to that consciousness, right? That's why we say illusion-like, right? Something illusion-like appears to be one thing, but isn't what it appears to be, right? But the illusion does exist as an illusion, right? We've talked about that before. So here he's saying conventional phenomena do exist as conventional phenomena. They appear in a certain way, and they don't exist in that way. And you know that because you realize, an ultimate consciousness can realize their ultimate nature. Then that reveals that things appear in a manner that's false. You'd say that. Right. So on the one hand, the ultimate is not truly established. Right? Because what is it? It's the mere negation of things existing inherently as they appear. I just want to point out one more thing again, which I've kind of said things like this before. I just want to point out because it's in here. I just want to remind people, right? In terms of ultimate truth, right? So ultimate truth, because he uses this term reasoning consciousness, right? Ultimate consciousness and reasoning consciousness. And here in this context, when they talk about a reasoning consciousness in this context, I think like you could say it's a consciousness analyzing the ultimate nature of things. Does that make sense? So, because in this, there are other kinds. I just want to point that out. There are other kinds of reasoning consciousnesses, right? Like, so there is we could reason like what's in school, like what's the nature of vision. If you're a scientist is studying what's the nature of vision and light waves or something, they're reasoning, but that's not an ultimate reasoning consciousness. Does that make sense? So in this context, sometimes Jeffrey Hopkins calls it ultimate analysis, right? A consciousness that's engaging in an analysis of the ultimate nature of things. Does that make sense? So that's the consciousness that leads to a ultimate truth. And so I'm differentiating that. So, and I addressed this once before, but I just want to address it again for a second. Right? Emptiness is found by such a consciousness, right? Like, so when a consciousness engages in ultimate analysis of the ultimate status of a cup, right? It'll eventually find emptiness. Right? That the cup, meaning that the cup is empty of existing in the manner in which it appears, which is it appears to be truly existent, And eventually that reasoning consciousness will find it doesn't exist in that way. Right? So emptiness is found by a consciousness engaging in ultimate analysis. That makes sense up to that point, I hope. Does that make sense? Okay. Now comes the tricky part, though. So emptiness is found by a consciousness engaging in ultimate analysis. But emptiness can't withstand ultimate analysis. Now what that means, right, is that when I analyze the ultimate nature of the cup, I find emptiness. Right? But then if I start to analyze, is emptiness truly exist? Because he says emptiness is also not truly established, right? If I start to analyze, is emptiness inherently existent? I'll find it's empty of inherent existence, right? So emptiness is found by ultimate analysis, but it can't withstand ultimate analysis in the sense that you'll find the emptiness of that emptiness if you analyze emptiness. If you analyze emptiness as being truly established, you'll find that it's empty. Right? And it's interesting, right? Because at that point, the first emptiness will be a conventional, right? At that point, so in other words, let's say it hasn't happened, right? But if it did, if I were to realize the ultimate nature of the cup, right? It's emptiness. And then I were to take that emptiness, right? At that point, because if you're in the state of realizing the emptiness of the cup, there's no other appearances, right? Your mind is just absorbed in emptiness. But let's say that I came out of that state and then I was thinking, wow, that's the emptiness of the cup. That's really there. That's truly existent, right? At that point, to that consciousness, it's now a conventional. I would be having a conventional consciousness, right? And that conventional consciousness would be having a false appearance of emptiness as a truly existent thing, inherently existent from its own side, right? And then I would be engaging in an analysis, ultimate analysis of that conventional phenomena, which is my false appearance of emptiness, right? The emptiness is appearing in a false manner to me. And then I would realize it's emptiness, which is its ultimate truth. Quite funny. And that all I'm doing is explaining what he says here. Emptiness, it's not truly established. Right? Even emptiness is found when you analyze things, but it's not existent inherently from its own side. Right? It's not independently existent. It's not inherently existent. It's not truly established. I'm just saying synonyms.
How do you analyze emptiness as not truly existent? Is it the same as analyzing a cup?
That's the tricky part, right? In other words, when emptiness appears, I want to differentiate something. When emptiness is appearing to an ultimate, when emptiness is the ultimate truth appearing, an actual emptiness that's appearing as an ultimate truth to an ultimate consciousness, at that time, it's totally non-conceptual. They say it's like water poured into water. That's the actual ultimate truth, right? At that time, there's no false appearance, right? What's appearing to the conscious at that time is true, right? He says in another part, he says, it exists in exactly the manner in which it appears. There's no false appearance at all. So at that time, one's mind is completely absorbed in emptiness, and one wouldn't do any ultimate. One wouldn't be engaging in any kind of analytical process, because one is in a non-conceptual state. So what I was saying is, after that, let's say the person came out of that state, right? And then they thought, that if the person were then to think, I just realized emptiness. And then at that time, now they're in a conventional consciousness, right? And their conventional consciousness would say, wow, that's really quite something. I realized emptiness. There's something like that. At that point, the emptiness that's appearing to a conventional consciousness seems like it's a truly existent thing, right? At that point, they could engage in an analysis. Does emptiness exist as it appears to me at this time? Right? Because it's a conventional appearance that's appearing, as he's saying, you can only engage in the analysis in relation to a conventional appearance, right? So once emptiness appears to a conventional consciousness and seems to be truly existent, then that person can analyze that and realize, oh, it doesn't exist.
So you have to hold that long enough so that you could analyze it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so we'll go to the next paragraph now. And there's a heading, right? It says, for something to be posited as conventionally existent, it must not be damaged by any valid cognition. So this is another important paragraph now. And what Lama Tsongkhapa is going to get into here is the nature of conventionally existent phenomena. Right? And so he says, therefore, although for something to be posited as conventionally existent, it need not be established by a reasoning consciousness of suchness, it must not be damaged by any valid cognition. That is, by a conventional or reasoning consciousness. And then he gives an example from the commentary on 60 Stanzas on Reasoning, where he says, it explains that since the appropriated aggregates conventionally abide as the four, impermanent and so forth, meaning impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless, the four, first, which are the four characteristics of the truth of suffering. That's what he's referring to there. The apprehension of those four is unmistaken in relation to that, and since the aggregates do not abide even conventionally as the opposite of those, as permanent, happy, existing with a self and existing inherently, the apprehension of those four is mistaken in relation to that. I'm going to pause and talk about what he said, because this is actually, again, like this is a very important part here. Because what he's getting at is, you know, you could say it this way, like, he already said above, right, in this page, when we started today, he said, phenomena exist as labeled by in dependence upon worldly designations, right? That was what he said earlier. Right? He was quoting the Buddha, actually, in the Prajnaparamita, it says that. But now what he's getting into is something about conventional phenomena, right? So, and how do you say this right? Like, things exist because through the power of worldly designation, right? But that what he's getting at now is that doesn't mean that anything you designate as existing exists, right? There's a traditional example they often use in Buddhism where they say the horns of a rabbit, right? Like if you see a rabbit and it has the ears and and it's night and you think it's like a little creature with horns, right? Those horns don't exist conventionally, right? It's a what's the word? It's a misperception. Misperception, yeah. And part of that is this, as what he's saying is, when he says it must not be damaged by any other valid cognition. So what he's getting at there is, this is not like you know, so the person designated that rabbit has horns, right? But the rabbit doesn't have horns, even conventionally, right? And what he's saying is like, you shouldn't, based on this analysis of emptiness, think that that like just because like it doesn't mean that just because you say something exists, it exists, right? And in this prasangika system, how do we determine what exists conventionally and what doesn't exist conventionally? That's what he's addressing here a bit, right? And what he's saying is, if somebody perceives something as existing, like the horns of a rabbit, right? Well, I don't want to go too far because he's going to say more, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, get ahead of Lama Tsongkhapa here. But what he's getting at in brief is what he actually says, right? It can't be harmed by another valid cognition, right? So, for example, if a person, and it could be, I just want to point this out, it could be somebody else's valid cognition or your own subsequent valid cognition, right? So if you see that little creature and then you get closer to it and then you start, you know, you look very carefully, you get closer, then you realize, oh, those were ears. Your own subsequent valid cognition would recognize, oh, my earlier assertion that had horns was wrong, right? Another could be like, you know, somebody who knows a lot about rabbits would sort of say to you, you know, like a little kid might do that, right? A little kid says, oh, look, that little creature has horns, right? And then their mom says, honey, those are ears. And they show them a picture of rabbits and they explain how rabbits, you know, bodies, what they're like or something, right? And so whether it's your own subsequent valid cognition or someone else's valid cognition, if it contradicts that designation, then that designation was wrong. Does that make sense? And that doesn't even exist conventionally. Now here, Lama Tsongkhapa uses an example, right? And this is quite an important one, actually, because I just want to go into this a little bit, because I think it's sometimes people get confused about this whole point. Like, sometimes people think, well, if everything's merely labeled, then whatever I label exists, right? Or they think like, what's it say, like, almost like, what, anything goes, or something like that. That's not what emptiness is saying, right? That's not what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, that's not what Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna are saying. And here he gives the example of the 4 characteristics of the First Noble Truth, right? And this one's very important, right? Because like here, I'm going to use the example of the second of those 4, right? So like one of the 4 characteristics of the truth of suffering is suffering, right? Meaning, and this is important. The reason why I want to say it is, in the world, right? There are many, many people who think, like, so the Buddha is asserting, right, in the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering, right? The Buddha is asserting that what many people think of as happiness is a form of suffering, right? Like, so the Buddha would say, like, you know, like, I'll just give a very simple example, like a conventional American example, right? Like, many Americans would say, normal people, I'm just saying, like, would say, yeah, like, eating a whole bunch of chicken wings and getting drunk while watching a football game on a Sunday is happiness, right? And the Buddha would say that's a form of suffering. And those, so then you have 2, right? And Arya Bodhisattvas would say that's a form of suffering. So now you have 2 different assertions, right? You have like maybe, well, I don't know, like 35 million people, I'm guessing, I don't know, asserting, oh, this is happiness, right? And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, even if 35 million people say something is a form of happiness, like, that doesn't mean it's a form of happiness. So it's not by vote. It's by valid cognition. Does that make sense? That's what he's saying. And the same way, right? If everybody, like, if 100 million people say the self is permanent, that doesn't make the self permanent, right? Well, that's another of those 4 characteristics, right? Impermanence, right? If millions of people, when you build a new building, right? Like actually you can imagine like when the Capitol building was first built, right? It's this big, huge edifice, and people would think, oh, it looks like some permanent phenomenon, right? That doesn't make it permanent, right? You can think that like when they founded, right? You can think of that as an example, like when the largest empire in the history of the planet, I think it was the Mongolian, after Genghis Khan's time, when they founded the empire, I forget what it's called, in China, they founded an empire. It would have been, this is permanent. This is the permanent, right? That didn't make it permanent. Right? It wasn't permanent. It never was, right? Even if like the strongest army of that time said this is permanent, it wasn't permanent. Does that make sense? So it doesn't, I'm just pointing out, like, what he's saying here is it has to be a valid cognition, right? And so if you think something's true, that doesn't make it true. Does that make sense? What makes something true is a valid cognition. And then there are 2 types of valid cognitions, right? There's an ultimate valid cognition, cognizing emptiness, right? And that, is not contradicted by other. That is like, even if somebody says that's not empty, it's truly existent, that doesn't negate that it's empty, actually, right? But here he's getting at conventional valid cognitions, right? And so what he's saying here is that there are various ways in which we have to check, is a valid cognition valid? Right? One is, so you'd have to check, right? It's not contradicted by your own other valid cognitions. It can't be contradicted by others' valid cognitions of the conventional. And he says here also it can't be contradicted by the ultimate cognition. Right? And this is again subtle. Yeah, I'll get into it because we're doing the whole thing, right? So we're going deep into this, so we'll cover it. Like, if you were to meditate on the emptiness of the cup, right, and then you were to hold the what's it called? Cynthia just said you have to hold on to something, right? So you hold on to the object of negation, actually, right, which is the inherently existing cup, right? And then you analyze, does that exist as one with the parts? Does it exist other than the parts, for example? And you realize that inherently existing cup doesn't exist at all, right? So that is a valid cognition that directly contradicts the existence of an inherently existing cup. So the inherently existing cup is then known to have never existed in the first place. Right? That doesn't contradict, though, the existence of a mere cup, a merely appearing cup. Does that make sense? Cup did appear, right, to consciousness. And so you have to be very subtle in your distinction, right? At the time when you're realizing emptiness, no cup at all is appearing, because all that's appearing to your mind is emptiness. That emptiness directly contradicts the existence of an inherently existent cup. But it's not contradicting that earlier a cup, there was a mere appearance of a cup. Does that make sense? So it doesn't contradict it, so it doesn't make that, doesn't invalidate that. And so you have to be very precise. My point is that you have to be precise when you're analyzing, does something on a conventional level, now this is not ultimate analysis, but conventionally if you're asking, does a thing exist or not, right? That we have to check, is it contradicted by any valid cognition? If it's completely, and contradicted doesn't mean not appearing to. I'm getting a little detailed for a second because I think it's an important point. I was thinking about this just yesterday as I was contemplating this, right? Example, I'll just be silly. The example that came to mind was I remember my grandfather who lived to 89. Sometimes he would eat peanuts. I remember. I was so for him, peanuts were nutritious. He lived a long time, right? But then sometimes I see there are kids, right, where even one peanut could kill them, right? So is a peanut nutritious or is it poisonous? Right? Well, there is that. Those two don't contradict each other, right? In other words, for one person they can be nutritious, and for somebody else they can be poisonous, and that's based on their particular biological makeup, right? Mm-hmm. So those don't contradict each other. Does that make sense? Because it's two different people and two different circumstances. So there are some times where in that case, each is a valid cognition, right? Mm-hmm. You see what I'm getting at? Those are two different perceptions of peanuts, but they're both valid from that person's biology and perspective. Then there are other times, though, where two cognitions directly invalidate each other, right? So if somebody says, Joe didn't rob the bank, right? And then later you have a video, somebody finds a video, right, and somebody had a phone and they videoed it, and then they can show, this is Joe robbing the bank. That directly contradicts that cognition, right? And so that's what he's getting at here. Does that make sense? If there's a valid cognition, later you watch that video and you realize, oh, he robbed the bank, right? That invalidates the previous one. Does that make sense? So that's what he's getting at here, is that for a conventional valid cognition, it can't be invalidated by any other cognition. So you have to differentiate. I'm just pointing out, you can differentiate something that invalidates from just a different cognition, right? And we know that, right? Anyway, I can keep giving examples, but do you get the point of that? Or should I don't need to go on with that problem. Okay. And so he gives this example here, right? So those four things, right? Impermanent, suffering, selfless, empty, and selfless. And he says, right, if somebody in the world, many people assert the opposite of those, right? That's what he's saying. Normal people assert that things aren't empty, that they're not selfless, that impermanent things are permanent, that suffering things are happy. And the fact that people think that doesn't make it true. And if they were to analyze on a conventional level more deeply, they could realize that, and then they would know that those aren't true. So the basis of what's a valid conventional object is that it's an object of valid cognition that's not contradicted by some other. And how we know it's valid is that it's not contradicted by any other cognition, valid cognition. So then he gives an example here. He says, he quotes commentary to the middle way. The self, as imputed by the Tritikas, carried away by the torpor of unknowing, and what is imputed to magical displays and illusions does not even exist from a worldly perspective, right? And so he's giving another example, right? Like an illusion, right? So if you go to a magic show and you see an illusion and you think it exists, right? And you would say, so if you said, she got sawed in half, typical silly trick, right? Your cognition of it, if you had that appeared to your eyes, right, looked like that, right? But the magician's valid cognition, knowing how he did the trick, or she did the trick, the person inside the box who knows how he did the trick, their valid cognition is a correct valid cognition, and yours is not a valid cognition, actually, right? It's contradicted, and therefore it doesn't even, and what he's saying is, those phenomena don't, whereas if you say, she was sawed in half, that didn't even happen conventionally, right? That didn't happen ultimately, it didn't happen conventionally, it didn't happen at all. He's using these obvious examples, but then you can get into, you can apply these then to your own, right? Like, because actually, I just want to point something out. This is important, right? On the one hand, being able to do an ultimate analysis and realize the ultimate truth is, from a Buddhist perspective, in terms of your own liberation, is the most important thing, right? That's what actually grants you liberation. But these other points are also very important, aren't they? Because if you see things as permanent when they're impermanent, that's going to create all kinds of problems for you, right? Or, if you think of an ordinary, like I can think of people I know, like who think hatred is a good thing, right? Hatred makes me happy. And I've met people like that. Probably you guys have too, right? And what he's saying is like, that, according to Buddhism's asserting that was never a valid cognition, that's not true conventionally, that's not true on any level. Hatred never leads to happiness, right? And I'm using those examples, but the problem is that we ourselves also have, on a conventional level, we ourselves have, what's the word? Things we assert conventionally that aren't true at all. And so this is important because we have to, what's the word? How do you come to know that those are not valid? Because actually it's quite easy to see something, it's easy to see when somebody else is having, like we all can easily see that somebody else is having, they're asserting something conventionally and it's not true, right? It's difficult to discover that for each of us, it's difficult to discover that what I'm asserting exists conventionally doesn't even exist conventionally. And how do we come to assert that? I mean, how do we come to realize that? Is through valid cognition, right? That's the value of understanding and sort of getting into the psychology of valid cognition. Is to really get to, well, if somebody else or I have a valid cognition that that's not true, then it's not even true conventionally. It's not true on any level, right? And so I'm just pointing this out, that this little paragraph seems simple, but it's actually very profound, isn't it? Because if we can realize that that the things we assert as conventionally existent don't exist, some of them, even conventionally, that's going to help us. Then when we realize that inherent existence also doesn't exist, then we become liberated from samsara, right? I sometimes think that, like, you sometimes say, like, the Buddha is somebody who became realistic. Right? Means, actually, what it means is that Buddhas only have valid cognitions. That's one of the definitions of a Buddha, actually. Like, so a Buddha, they sometimes call it like one who became valid or something, became authoritative. That there is, Dignaga and Dharmakirti use that epithet for the Buddha. So the idea is that a Buddha, when a Buddha perceives something, everything a Buddha perceives is a valid cognition. Right? Whereas for us, of course, we have all kinds of things that we perceive that are not. We don't perceive valid cognitions regarding ultimate, and we also, in regards to conventional, we superimpose all kinds of things that aren't true ultimately, but also that aren't true conventionally. Does that make sense? So I'm just pointing out the value of this, that this is really important for us in terms of as practitioners. Because we have, the goal is to become, what's the word? To have more and more of our perceptions be valid, be correct, not be in contradiction to the fact of how things are. So not perceiving impermanent things as permanent. Not perceiving, we often perceive things that are the cause of our suffering as if they were going to lead us to happiness. Does that make sense? And if we perceive something as leading to happiness and it doesn't lead to happiness, that's wrong conventionally. Anyway, you get my point. Okay, so then, yeah.
How is that different from the peanut example? Like, the truth for someone is different from the truth for someone else, that example. Because it depends on the biological makeup of that person. But in that in the case of someone who has a different mental makeup, then won't that be also, how's that different? It's like, I feel like
Yeah.
the difference is only that it's subtler because it's mental.
Yeah, no, you're asking a good question, and I want to give I want to kind of address that. Like, so the because it's actually right. It's a subtle point to get at. Like that, there are some things, mental or physical, actually, that could be valid from two different. Like so, I'll give an example. Like if because that was an example I gave that was physical, right? But like there are things mentally also like I'm trying to think of an example of a mental one. Okay, I can give one. Like that's according. I want to make sure it's according to Buddhism, so that Buddhism would agree. But um, like actually, the Buddha himself would say, right, that the teachings of the Prasangika view of emptiness are helpful to being sentient beings, right? But then the Buddha would also say that wouldn't, in general, they're helpful because they're true, right? That's what Buddha would say. But then Buddha would say you shouldn't, that like, and His Holiness Dalai Lama says this, right? That you should, like one time I remember this, like the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama was meeting with some Christian leader. I'm just giving an example. He was meeting with some Christian leaders, right? And they were talking about love and compassion. And there was a very harmonious, they were saying, oh, we both meditate on love and compassion. Monks, like, they were like Christian monks. And he was saying, we Buddhist monks meditate on love and compassion, you also do. And they were comparing their methods of meditating on love and compassion. And they agreed because there was a recognition that was, first, now this part was valid for both, right? That love and compassion are good things. Then the one Christian monk said, oh, I read something about emptiness. Can you explain emptiness to me? And His Holiness Dalai Lama said, oh no, that would be harmful to you. Like, because emptiness teaches that there's no external creator, but you have faith in God, and that's part of your spiritual practice that leads you to love and compassion. So let's not talk about that, right? That would be harmful to you. So that's like the peanut example, right? Like for somebody who's practicing Mahayana Buddhism, studying emptiness is very helpful, right? But as long as the Dalai Lama was saying, for somebody who's practicing love in the Christian tradition, studying emptiness would actually harm them, right? Because then they would start to doubt that, like that person's meditation was that all beings are equally children of God, because God created all of them. And since everybody was created by the same God, we're all brothers and sisters, so I should love everybody, right? Now, if that person were to suddenly start doubting, well, maybe God doesn't exist, then it would undermine their practice of love. And so the Dalai Lama said, that wouldn't be helpful to you, right? So it's like the example with the peanut, that there is that the peanut's nutritious for one person and not nutritious for other, that the idea of emptiness, even the Dalai Lama says, right, who's probably the best teacher on the planet of emptiness at this time, said, that's excellent, for a Mahayana Buddhist, it's excellent to meditate on this, but for a Christian monastic who's meditating on love, they shouldn't think about it even. So that would be an example where it's a mental phenomena that can help one person but not help another. And yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So then Lama Tsongkhapa continues here. I'll just continue reading. He says, this is saying that the self, the primal matter, and so forth, imputed by Forders, so meaning the Tritikas, as well as objects conceived as horses and elephants and the like, of illusions, do not even conventionally exist. And that's clear, right, that we were saying that. Those things don't even exist conventionally. He said that. Then he says, therefore, so here he's addressing people who misunderstand the Prasangika view. Therefore, the proposition that it is the Prasangika approach to posit as conventionally existent what only exists for a mistaken mind is meaningless babble. None of the great Madhyamikas asserts this either. Right? So, in other words, that what he's saying there is, some people think that because, like, actually, Okay, he's going to say it more in the next paragraph, but so I won't go into it yet. But so what he's saying here is this point that you'll remember this point though, because now he's going to go into more detail about it. But what he's saying is, just to be clear, right, is that some people think that prasangika, because prasangika say everything exists merely through designation, right? Some people, and that it's all, and also remember earlier that conventional truths appear to a mistaken mind, right? So some people think, well then prasangikas must say whatever you label, you know, it all appears to a mistaken mind, like horns of a rabbit, you know, illusory elephants. So they're the same, like an actual elephant, an illusory elephant, or you know, whatever the person, there's all mistaken minds, and there's all labels, so it's all the same thing. And he's saying no prasangika, no majjhamaka asserts that. That's a wrong understanding, right? Because some things, what's the word, do exist conventionally, and other things that are asserted to exist conventionally don't exist at all, even conventionally. Does that make sense? So he's just clarifying that point. And then he goes just a little further here. He says, also the commentary, in the commentaries in the Middle Way by Chandrakirti, objects and subjects are taken to be equal in terms of existence and non-existence. However, not in terms of mere existence and non-existence in general. Rather, the two are taken to be equal in terms of inherent existence and non-existence. So here what he's saying is just this, is, you know, like there is some, we've said this before, there are some Buddhist schools that say, first of all, like the mind-only school, right, says external phenomena don't exist apart from the mind, and that everything is, you know, it's called mind-only school, right, it says everything, but the mind is truly existent. But he said, first one thing he's noting here is that from a prasangika majjhamaka point of view, internal things and external things equally lack inherent existence, right, or empty, or equally empty, and also equally have mere existence, right, have a kind of mere conventional existence. So they don't differ. One point he's making is they don't differentiate between those in terms of their existential status, because there are some Buddhist schools that give that sort of, yeah, that believe that consciousness has kind of somehow more existence, a more like a kind of a more, what's the word? They assert a kind of more, they assert some kind of inherent existence to consciousness, but not to external phenomena. That's not the view of Majjhamaka. That's one point. Then another point he's making here, though, is also that I just want to point this out, that also when you have like in this example of an illusion, right? So a person who sees an illusory horse, right? That it's actually interesting, right? If a person, if a person sees an actual, like a person goes to a horse farm and sees an actual horse, right? Then the consciousness perceiving the horse and the horse itself both exist conventionally, and both are empty of inherent existence, is their ultimate status. Does that make sense? Now, if a person goes to a magic show and sees an illusory horse, right, then there's a consciousness perceiving an illusory horse, right? In that instance, the horse being perceived doesn't exist conventionally. But the consciousness perceiving the illusory horse does exist conventionally. Does that make sense? So in that case, they have a different existential status, or a different reality status, conventional reality status. That makes sense, right? Okay.
Actually, wouldn't the illusion exist conventionally?
The illusion, you could say the illusion exists conventionally, but the horse doesn't exist conventionally. If the illusion is of a horse, right? So if somebody's seeing an illusory horse, you could say, you can't, like you would have to say, does the horse exist conventionally? No. Does it exist? Does an illusion, you know, like did a person see it? Did the person attend a magic show? Yes. Like, so if I went to a magic show and saw an illusory elephant, for example, right? Did the elephant exist conventionally? No. Was there an illusion of an elephant? Yes.
So, okay.
Conventionally.
So, but you're adding more to it than is there because of your conceptual minds. The idea that the elephant does not exist is really not useful. I mean, that all you're seeing is the illusion.
Right. And that's what he's saying earlier, because remember, like a couple paragraphs above, where he said, even conventionally, he's making this distinction, right? That there are some things that, even though they appear, that even conventionally they don't exist. There are other things that appear conventionally and do exist conventionally. So he's making this differentiation. So that's why I'm making this careful distinction that, like the illusory appearance of an elephant, right? One did have an illusory experience of an elephant, but did that elephant exist conventionally? No, because it's invalidated by, according to his criteria, right? It's invalidated by another valid cognition.
Doesn't seem helpful.
What?
It doesn't seem helpful. I mean, is it really necessary to push it that far?
To push which that far? Just explain.
The explanation, that the part that the elephant doesn't exist doesn't seem helpful. Useful.
I'll explain why I think
Okay.
why Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, he's saying I think it's useful, and the reason why I think what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, this is why he uses the example of the 4 characteristics of the truth of suffering. In other words, whether in the case of the elephant, it's not relevant to one's attainment of liberation or enlightenment or something. But he's using that as an example to make a point, which is that like when he's talking about the 4 characteristics of the truth of suffering, I want to give a real example of why it's important. Like, so there, right? Like, ordinary people every day, like it's what stops us from practicing Dharma, actually. Like, because like we give rise to a false appearance in ordinary life, just like the, like that are, so ordinary people, right? You're giving rise to appearance that like, if I can get this much money, I'll be happy. And the money appears the source of happiness. If I can get this attractive partner, then I'll be happy. And then the partner appears to be a source of happiness. If I can have that chocolate cake, then I'll be happy. Then the chocolate cake appears to be a source of happiness. If I can have that car, then I'll be happy. And then the car appears to be a source of happiness. And what he's saying is those appearances to the mind of an ordinary person, there's this appearance that occurs to them that all these different objects of desire are sources of happiness. And what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is those, even conventionally, don't exist as sources of happiness. And that's a false appearance even conventionally. It's, and what he's saying is that we have to be able, so he uses the example of the illusory elephant, which is not relevant to the path to enlightenment, to make a point, which is, in our ordinary daily lives, what Lama Tsongkhapa would say here is, we don't actually practice, like we don't practice the Dharma, because we're so caught up in chasing after these things, and those things, does the cake, there's 2 different issues. Does the chocolate cake, does it ultimately exist as chocolate, inherently from its own side? No. That's not what he's saying here. What he's saying here is, even conventionally, does that exist as a source of happiness? No. The sources of happiness are virtuous karma. If you say, what's the cause of happiness, according to Buddhism, right? Buddhism, this is what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, that according to Buddhism, the source of happiness is goodness, is virtue, is love, is compassion, is those things, right? Is morality, is generosity. But if the person is asserting, if I have a false appearance, just like I had the false appearance at the magic show, if I have a false appearance that chocolate cake is the ultimate source of happiness, then that blocks me from practicing Dharma, because instead of trying to practice Dharma, I spend my life trying to get chocolate cake. And then I never practice the path, and then I die and continue suffering in samsara. And so he's saying that that's why it's important spiritually to be able to differentiate on a conventional level that some things that I assert to exist conventionally not only are not ultimately existent, but don't even exist conventionally, because that's blocking me from actually practicing the path. That's why it's so important. And so the example of an elephant or a horse, he's just using it because that's sort of obvious, because what we don't see usually you know, we can, that's what I was saying, like, he uses examples that anybody can sort of recognize, like, oh yeah, if I saw an illusory elephant, the elephant didn't exist, because later I could find out, you know, if I went later and tried to get elephant poop for my farm, there's no poop from that elephant, because it was an illusory elephant, and so I can't fertilize my field with it. It doesn't function, in other words, right? But he's saying that's obvious. But then we have to apply that, that's why he mentions the 4 aspects of the First Noble Truth, right? We have to apply that to our own, these things that block us spiritually, actually. And one is like, you know, again, if I think that chocolate cake is the source of all happiness, then that's going to block me from practicing Dharma, and so on. You get my point. So that's why it's important. Is that he's saying it's very important to be able to differentiate things that, there's 2 different issues. One is, do things ultimately exist in the way in which they appear? But here he's not addressing that. Here he's addressing, sometimes we assert things to be conventionally, that we assert that this exists conventionally and it doesn't even exist conventionally. And that becomes a huge obstacle for us. Same way, if you're really angry, for example, right, and you think, this person is the source of all my problems, they're a jerk, or whatever, like, right, they're the source of my suffering, right? What he's saying is, like, the source of your suffering is your own, right? I mean, the source of my suffering is my own mind, right? Is my negative karma, is my mental afflictions, my tendency to be agitated, you know, like, and when I assert this person is the source of all my suffering, that is not even true conventionally. That was not true ultimately, but even conventionally, that's a false appearance to my mind. And when I realize, have a valid cognition of that, then I'll be happier. So it's very important at this point about, like, that's where it becomes very important. To be able to differentiate many things that I assert conventionally to be existent don't even exist conventionally. That's why it's important. Does that make sense, kind of?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so the example of the elephant is just, or horse, or those are like obvious examples, but then, because, and part of that is because it's so hard, like, you know, when we're actually in that assertion that something exists conventionally which doesn't exist conventionally, actually if somebody says to me that's not true, I might get mad at them, actually, right? Like I might say, shut up. So, you know, because I'm so attached to the idea that what I assert conventionally exists conventionally, even when it doesn't. Yeah, yeah.
I have a question about, like, you were talking about how karma's true happiness. Right? Karma's happiness, you say?
Oh, is that like, so? Yeah, karma would, well, let's say like according to Buddhism, right? The cause of happiness is virtuous karma. The cause of suffering is negative karma. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds good, but I don't know. I don't know about that, because I always have this thing that I always say, like happiness is a choice, it's a decision like you make. So regardless if you do a good deed and that, I mean, for the most part, like that could be true, but not necessarily like all times you do a good deed and you know, or you have, let's say, good intention of doing something, but not necessarily does it come out to you. So you know, you might be trying to do a good deed, but it doesn't come out that way. So you know, I would question that, like the happiness part, like, because it's not necessarily. You understand what I'm saying?
So are you? I want to check. Like, are you saying that? I'm not sure if you're saying that if you're saying that there are other, like, that sometimes you can choose to be happy even when something difficult is happening to you, or if you're
Right.
saying
But
you might do something good and it could lead to, like, you could do an
Both.
act of positive karma and it could lead to suffering.
right, both.
You're saying, well, because I guess regarding the second one, first, that's easier, right? So the idea that a person could do a virtuous action and it would lead to suffering, Buddhism anyway, I'm just, you know, representing that. Like, and Lama Tsongkhapa says that early in this text where he talks about there are 4 characteristics of karma and one is definite. Karma is definite. So he says, and the Buddha says, if you do a virtuous action, even if in the short run, like due to some circumstance it doesn't lead to what you intended, that in the long run that will bring happiness to you. Like, so, as if you do something out of a genuine, sincere motivation of love, in the short run, the other person might say, "Get lost." I don't, whatever. Like, you could go and try to be loving to somebody, and they could say, "Shut up," and "I don't like you," or something. That's possible. But in the long run, because your motivation was good, what they say is, if you had a positive motivation, a positive intention, and then you you engage in the action and you brought it to completion, even if the other person didn't like it, that in the long run, because your motivation was good and you did a positive action, it will eventually lead to some kind of happiness, a good result for you. Not in the short run, but in the long run. That's one point. That's the Buddhist assertion on that one, at least. And the same thing with negative. Like, because there are times where, like, a person, like, they give, it's a simple example, right? If a person, like, successfully steals from somebody, right? In the short run, they might think, "Oh, great, now I have money and I'm gonna, whatever." Like, in the short run, they would think they're happy. But what Buddhism is asserting is, like, if the person out of attachment stole from somebody else, eventually in the long run, that's gonna lead them to a suffering experience due to the force of karma, and that karma is definite. So that's a Buddhist view, is that eventually that karma will ripen in the form of a suffering. That they'll not have resources, that they'll be stolen from, that they'll be born in a bad place or whatever. Like, all these kinds of results will happen. So that's the Buddhist view on that, is that in the long run it will lead to a corresponding result in the nature of, that corresponds to the motivation and the action done. That's the Buddhist view on that, is that it's a long-term perspective in a way. Regarding your other point, though, that I think you have a point. In the sense that, if a person practices, like, mind training, training their mind, so that even when difficult things happen, they can keep their mental peace and their sense of happiness. That's true. That's possible. Like, so that even when difficult things, like, ordinarily, when something bad happens, people get, miserable, right? But a person could train their mind such that, even when bad things happen, like, maybe there might still be some kind of, for example, like physical suffering or or some difficult circumstance happens, but the person, due to mind training, can train themselves so that they don't lose their sense of equanimity or their sense of inner peace. That's possible, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, so now he says, although phenomena are merely posited by the power of conventions, this does not eliminate their establishment by valid cognition and so forth. And this is what I was saying, is he's going to further now elaborate on what he just said. And yeah, so we'll cover this. So he says, first I'll read what he says and I'll explain it. I'll read part of what he says. He says, that being so, whatever is posited as conventionally existent is posited as existent by the power of nominal conventions. But not everything posited by the power of these is asserted to be conventionally existent. So that's first of all, that first sentence is what we've already been saying, right? Like, that in other words, things exist through the power of nominal convention, but, we said that, right? But just because I say such and such exists, that doesn't mean it exists, right? That's clear. Because it could be, and why? Because it could be invalidated by a valid cognition. And if it's invalidated by a valid cognition, it's not existent, even conventionally. Then he says, although phenomena are asserted as merely posited by the power of conventions, the word mere eliminates the meaning that they are not subjective conventions. It does not eliminate that all the objects posited are established by valid cognition. So what he's saying there is things that exist conventionally can be established by valid cognition. And that's a Prasangika Madhyamaka view. Because again, like sometimes, I just want to explain this, because I mean, people get confused with this. I remember when I first heard that, I want to go back to the definition of conventional truth for a second. because part of the definition of conventional truth here is, it was that it appears in a false manner, right? You know, like, because it appears to be truly existent, but it's not truly existent. We've been talking about that. I remember when I first heard that, I thought, well, if it's false, if it appears falsely, how's it a valid cognition? I remember thinking that. I thought, well, then maybe not. Maybe there's no. I had that doubt when I first read that definition or studied that. I thought, well, then maybe there's no such thing as valid cognition. It's all false, right? Like, and what he's saying, you know, because it appears to be truly existent, but it's not truly existent. And so I had some doubt. I was like, well, how can that be? Maybe nothing's valid. Maybe nothing. You could maybe it's nihilistic, right? Like maybe nothing exists. You can have that doubt. And what he's saying here is that's wrong, right? That what he's saying is just because something appears to be inherently existent and doesn't inherently exist doesn't mean it's completely non-existent. And it doesn't mean you can't have a valid cognition of it, right? And so you can have a valid cognition of a cup as a cup, right? Now the fact that that cup appears to be inherently existent and doesn't exist that way, the fact that it doesn't exist that way is its ultimate truth, right? But that ultimate truth, which is that it doesn't exist inherently, doesn't negate that there's a mere cup there that you can drink out of, that functions, right? That you can fill with water, you know, it's not, or tea or whatever. And so what he's saying there is just because things, you know, if you ask how do they exist through the power, you know, so the cup, how does the cup exist? It exists because it's merely labeled, right? You say that sometimes. But that doesn't mean it can't function, right? And it doesn't mean you can't have a valid cognition of it. You know, and yeah, anyway, so that's up to that point what he's saying. Now he says, and this is where it gets a bit, yeah, this will be the last thing we'll cover is this paragraph. This paragraph is a little, it's interesting and also challenging. He says, this system is not dissatisfied with such a way of positing phenomena by the power of conventional imputation, right? So one point he's saying there is, in the Prasangika view school, right, it not dissatisfied, I mean, it's enough that it exists through the power of imputation, as merely labeled. Now he says, what it does not do is search for an imputed object that is not merely posited, but exists in accordance with its meaning. And if it is found that exists in accordance with its meaning, and if it is found posited as existing, whereas otherwise posited as non-existent. So here he's differentiating something, which is a difference between the Prasangika Madhyamaka school and the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school. And I think it's a very interesting kind of distinction that he's drawing, that these two schools draw. They're both Madhyamakas, but the Prasangika, remember, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective, but also from most of Tibetans' perspective, is the ultimate correct view. Right? But what he's getting at here is that, let me see this right. Again, I just want to pause. This is you know, earlier I said that the harmony of dependent arising and emptiness is the difficult point. Now I'm getting it even the more, like this is that again, but from a subtler perspective. Okay, so I'm warning you, it's subtle, it's difficult. We're fair warning. And you'll understand, actually, if you think about this, you'll actually have sympathy for the Svatantrika position, even though it's not the ultimate position. Svatantrikas say, you know, and I'm going to go back to how did he actually say it here. Search for an imputed object that is not merely posited like that, but exists in accordance with the meaning, right? So a Svatantrika would say, if the cup exists conventionally, you should be able to find something that corresponds to the meaning, that corresponds to the word cup, right? Like you'd be able to find something, like Svatantrikas say, dependent arising means that there has to be, like, they still say it's dependent upon like the subject and object, right? But they say for something to exist, there should be some cupness from the side of the object, and then there has to be a conscious perceiving that cupness, and then the cup exists. Does that make sense? And if you look, you should be able to find some cupness there. Does that make sense? That's sort of, they're not saying it exists independently, but they're saying it should exist from its own side, from the side of the object, and then the subject should also see it, and then you say that's a cup, right? And and that's where he's saying, so so it exists in accordance with the meaning, right? That means there should be some cupness, right? I'm saying cup, but there should be some cupness or something corresponding to cup, right? That exists from the side of the object. They search for the imputed object and they find something. Does that make sense? And what they would say is that something truly existent? No, but conventionally, there's something there from the side of the object. Right? That would be the Svatantrika position. Prasangika Madhyamikas say, as soon as you started searching this from the side of the object, is there some cupness there? You're engaging in ultimate analysis. That's not a conventional question. Right? They would say, that, and then you have to go all the way in analyzing that. And if you do, you're not going to find any. You're going to have a problem, right? Because you're going to find what? So if you search all the electrons and protons and neutrons, there's no cupness there. They would say no. If you're really going to search, what they're saying is, conventionally they're satisfied. The cup's holding the tea. I labeled it a cup. So he said here, right? How did he say it? They are not dissatisfied. That means they're satisfied, right? With such a way of positing phenomena by the power of conventional imputation. Right, so for a prasangika, they would just say, like, it's merely labeled. Holds the tea and drank out of it. Is there? And they would say, if you start to ask, is there some cupness there from the side of the object? Now you're engaging ultimate analysis, and they're going to say, that's our specialty. Great. Okay, you're going to engage in ultimate analysis. Where is the cupness? Does it exist? On the protons? Are there protons that, from the time of when they were formed in a star exploding, were cup? Right. Electrons? Are there? At the Big Bang, those were cup electrons that flew out of the Big Bang. So they would say no. There's no such. If you're engaged in ultimate analysis, looking for something from the side of the object, then you have to be completely. You have to go all the way in that analysis, and you're not going to find it, right? So they say, so you can see how from both sides it makes sense, right? From a Svatantrika perspective, they would say, you can see how a person would want to say that. Well, there's something, yes, it depends on the mind, but there has to be something there, right? That's also cup from the side of the object. You can see how somebody would want to assert that, right? But prasagikas are saying, as soon as you start to assert that there's something inherently on the side of the object, you're engaging in ultimate analysis. Let's engage in ultimate analysis, and then you won't find it. Does that make sense? So they say you have to be satisfied that there's an appearance, there's a label, so that's existent. If there's a valid, there's a, what's the word? There's an appearance and a valid label on that appearance, and it functions, that's enough. Right? And they say you don't have to engage in this analysis, does it exist from the side of the object? That once you start to do that, you're engaging in ultimate analysis, and ultimate analysis won't find anything there. So I'll continue on with how he says it, because like I said, it's a little challenging.
Do you still believe in emptiness then? They wouldn't...
Yeah, so they would say, the Svatantrika Madhyamikas assert emptiness, but they don't, it's just, what's the word? It's less subtle. They say, because it depends, what they would say is, because there's something from the side of the object, some kind of cupness there, and there's some subject of mind perceiving that, right? That it's empty of existing independently. Depends upon both. They would say so. It's empty of independent existence because it's not independent. It depends upon perceiver and perceived. It depends upon something from the side of the object and something from the side of the subject. And when those come together, then there's a conventionally existent phenomena, but because it depends upon both, it's not ultimately, or it's not, ultimately it's not existent, or it's empty of independent existence, that's the correct way to put it. Whereas, you see the difference now. So they would say that's the meaning of emptiness. And then the prasangikas are getting more subtle, right? Because they're saying, no, when you assert that, you're still asserting that something exists inherently from the side of the object. That's still an assertion of, that's still, what's the word? A superimposition. You're still projecting. Because if I search for that, that doesn't exist. So they would say that's like adding something extra that doesn't exist. And so they're asserting a subtler view of emptiness. But they both would agree that things are empty. They just have a slightly different meaning. Very slightly, but a slightly different meaning in terms of what does emptiness mean. So okay, then he says, where we live. So okay, here we go. So this is what I was saying about it. This is where he's saying. So he says rather the Prasangikas assert that if something findable emerged as one searches, with this search method, it will be truly established, right? So that's what I was saying. In that Svatantrika position, they're saying there should be something there from this, something existent from the side of the object that's contributing, right? It's dependently arisen from their perspective, but still there's something from the side of the object, something from the side of the subject. They're both. And now he's saying, well, if one is searching from Prasangika perspective now, if something is findable, right? If somebody is searching for something from the side of the object, and you find it, then it's truly existent, and it's inherently existent, and it's not empty. They're saying, so that's what I meant when he said, I said that, then they would be, you're engaging in ultimate analysis, right? They would say, that's an ultimate analysis, that if you found some cupness from the side of the object, then that's a truly existent, inherently existent cup. It was always a cup, it always will be a cup, it's a cup from its own side, it's inherently a cup. And he would say, but that's not the case, right? That's an impossibility, that's not how things exist. So he's saying that's why it's wrong to assert that there's something findable from the side of the object that has its own nature, we'll call it that. Its own nature, meaning cup, right? In this case. Or in this case, it would be its own nature being rosary, mala, right? If the mala has something from its own side that's mala-ness, he's saying, then it should be findable, right? And then if it's findable, then it's truly existent. And if it's truly existent, it's permanent and eternal and intrinsic and inherent, but that's not how it exists, right? It exists, and so he's saying, so you have to be satisfied it exists as a mere appearance, merely labeled, or by the power, how does he say it? By the power of conventional designation. Now he says, therefore, it does not assert, meaning the Prasangikas, so the Prasangikas do not assert, even conventionally, that anything is found to exist upon such analysis. Right? Because they say, as soon as you start to analyze in an ultimate way, you're not going to find anything. Because that's the nature of ultimate, right? We're getting it, because what we're talking about here is ultimate consciousness, right? That once you start to engage in that ultimate analysis about the ultimate status of things, even conventionally, so he's saying, once you start to engage in that, you're no longer in the realm of the convention. You're asking an ultimate question. And if you're going to ask an ultimate question, you're not going to find something that exists from its own side. So here he says, from there, the dividing line between analyzing and not analyzing suchness is also drawn. So the Prasangikas see that if something established by way of its own character existed, it would have to exist by way of its own entity, as an object not merely posited by the power of subjective designations. Having seen that, they do not even conventionally assert inherent existence by way of its own character, or existence by way of its own entity. This has been explained in detail elsewhere. He's saying he wrote more about that in the great treatise on the stages of Pat Lamrim Chenbo, the great, longer. So, what he's saying there, I want to go back, there's one sentence he said that I thought was, I want to highlight for a second. Right, he said, he says, I just want to go back where I left off. So he says, they do not assert even conventionally that anything is to be found upon such analysis. From there, the dividing line between analyzing and not analyzing suchness is drawn, right? So you get the point, that's what I was saying. In other words, that as soon as you start to, from a Prasangika perspective, this is what I'm saying, that as soon as you begin to ask that something exists from the side of the object, that's the point where he's saying that's the dividing line. You've now begun ultimate analysis, right? Svatantrikas don't agree with that. They think, you know, they think that's a valid conventional sort of discussion. And what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, and what Prasanghikas are saying is, no, like worldly, like that's, like in other words, worldly people just say pass the cup. You know, like, or you know, what's the cup made of? You know, is it glass or is it ceramic or is it whatever? But that once you start to ask, is there something there from the side of the object that exists as that thing by its own nature or by its own entity, you're asking an ultimate question. And so he says that's the dividing line. As soon as you start to ask that question, you've entered into ultimate analysis. And what Prasanghikas are saying is, again, once you enter into ultimate analysis, then you have to really engage in ultimate analysis. And if you do, you know, and we know that, right? You can check for yourself, right? If you start to analyze, you know, does the cup exist on the atoms? Or does the cup exist, you know, does the cup exist, you know, this thing broke. Is this the cup, right? Well, no, right? Like, in other words, if I handed you this and said, here, have, you know, here, pour your tea in there, it's not going to work, right? If I take the other part off. You know, if I broke this all apart into pieces, right? And gave you each piece and said, use as a cup, you can't use it as a cup, right? The cup doesn't exist on any of the parts, right? It also doesn't exist separately from the part. It doesn't exist as something apart from all the parts, right? So he's saying once you start to engage in that analysis, what you're going to find is there is no cup existing from its own side. That's an ultimate question, and when you engage in that, you're going to eventually come to the point of realizing that the object of negation doesn't exist at all. And so he's saying here, so I'll read again this sentence. So the Prasanghikas see that if something established by way of its own character, right? Now you know what I mean by way of its own character, right? It means like cupness, right? That the cup existed by way of its own character there, right? He's saying if that were true, it would have to exist by way of its own entity, like a truly existent real cup there, right? If that were true, it wouldn't exist just through the power of designation. It would be a truly existent, inherently existing cup, right? And he's saying, you know, once that, you know, well, actually, he's saying a number of things then. One is, then it wouldn't be empty, right? And then it would be eternal, then it would be permanent, then it would be, and that's not how it exists. So he's saying you have to, according to the Prasangika school, and he say they're not dissatisfied, right? They're satisfied, in other words, by saying, well, from a worldly perspective, this is a cup. You know, from a conventional perspective, that's a cup. Pass the cup. You know, they don't. That world. They're saying like from a worldly perspective, from a conventional perspective, that's sufficient, right? Is the cup broken? Is it not broken? This one's broken, but can it still function? It's not that broken yet. Something like that, right? But I just want to slow down for a second, just to contemplate together for a second. You can see both, right? You can see why, from the perspective of the Majjhamaka, Prasangika Majjhamakas, you can see why there is, let's say this right, why they're saying it exists through the mere power of conventional designation, right? Because if you engage in any further assertion about its ultimate status, that's not going to send up to reasoning and analysis, right? And as soon as you start to do that, you have to analyze, and then you don't find. You can also see, though, like from the Svatantrika's perspective, right? They're brilliant philosophers. You can see how from their perspective, they find it difficult, actually, right? They would say, well, if there's not some cupness there from its own side, then why can't I make a phone call on this? You know, or something. Why can't I ride this like home instead of my car? Right? There must be something about it from its own side, right? Inherently, that makes it function as a cup, whereas the car functions as a car, and the phone functions as a phone, and the rosary functions as a rosary, and the micro. Like, they're saying there has to be something inherently there. You can see how they would feel that, right? I mean, like, you can see how, like, well, and what's the Prasangika, what's the word? The Prasangika response to that is, if the cup were inherently cup, right, then the plastic in it couldn't become part of a microphone later, or a phone later, right? Like, in other words, they're saying, no, there's nothing inherently cup about cup, right? It exists through the mere power of designation, and it's changeable, right? Those if you recycle that plastic, you might somebody could like turn it into a phone, right? Part of the phone, part of the case of a phone or something, right? It's not inherently from its own side at all. There's nothing from its own side that makes it inherently cup, right? Why does it function as a cup? Through the power, through the power of mere designation and mere dependent origination. That through dependent causes and conditions, right now it has this appearance that allows it to function as a cup. If other causes and conditions arise, it could be part of a fender on the car and so on. Like there's nothing that makes it inherently that from its own side. It's mere dependent origination. Right? It's mere, and there are different types of, right there, remember, there are three levels of dependent upon causes and conditions, dependent upon parts, and dependent upon label, right? So it's merely that. There's nothing else that makes it, that makes the label, that allows one to say, now I'm having a valid cognition of a cup, right? The only reason you can have the valid cognition of a cup is because of dependent origination. But there's nothing from its own side, right? You see the difference. You can see how both, you can see why both would assert what they assert. I'm just pointing that out, that they're both like interesting, and if you, and part of it is like, if you start meditating on this, right, you'll find that like, that you want to assert that there's something, that you want to assert there's something from the side of the object, right? The same thing with yourself, right? When you meditate on the emptiness of yourself, there's a very deep wish, actually, to assert that there's something, what's the word? Here I'm saying cupness, but there's some meanness there. There's some I-ness there from the side of the object, right? And that's the difference, actually. Like, the Svatantrikas would say, there are different sub-schools of Svatantrika, but for the most part, Svatantrikas would say, well, the mental consciousness is the, is the basis upon which I label. Ultimately, that's the, they would say kind of, from a conventional perspective, you have to have both, something from the side of this, from both sides, right? So from one side there's label, like Lorne, right? On the other side there is the mental consciousness that's there. That's the kind of real basis for that, conventionally, right? Prasanghikas would say, again, like as soon as you start to say, oh, conventionally there's a real basis, which is the mental consciousness, then the mental consciousness has to really be Lorne, right? In my case, right? And they would say, well, once you start to assert that, well, analyze it. Was it this moment of mental consciousness? Was it that moment of mental consciousness? Was it, no, right? Each moment, that's not Lorne. They would say that's it. Now that you're engaging in ultimate analysis, so let's really analyze. Again, no, you can't find it, right? But you can see how there's a feeling of wanting to say there's some basis that's has something of that. What's the word he uses? Of its own character, right? Or of its own entity. You see, I'm just trying to really flesh out this distinction. Does that make sense, kind of? Yeah.
Why are we learning this distinction here? Why is it helpful?
I'm hesitating because there are a couple different answers to that. Like, I'll give a few different ones. Like, because one reason I think there are different reasons why Lama Tsongkhapa is sort of analyzing this at this point. But to put it, I'll start with, like, in general, I'll make a general point, right? He's talking, because this is a section on ultimate truth, right? And so, what he's getting at in part is how does one realize, because this is actually very important from a practice perspective, it's the most important question actually, right? How does one realize the ultimate truth? That's what actually matters in a sense for our practice, right? And so what he's been saying here is if you want, and why is that important? Of course, because that's the way to achieve liberation and enlightenment, right? And so if you want to realize the ultimate truth, first of all, he's been pointing out, you have to start by looking, ultimate truth is an ultimate consciousness that's realizing something non-conceptually, right? That's realizing an emptiness in a non-conceptual, direct, manner like water poured into water, right? But what Lama Tsongkhapa knows, first of all, is we're not already, this book is not for people who are in that state, this book is for people who are striving to achieve that, right? So then, how does one proceed to achieve that realization? So one point he's been making over and over here is, you have to start by looking at the conventional, right? It is because to realize the ultimate truth, you're realizing the ultimate nature of conventional phenomena, right? So one point he's making is, so you might start with your I, right? Ultimately, right, he said that earlier. So you start with your own self, right, really. I'm using cup because it's easier, but you start with yourself, actually, right? And so you have to recognize how you're, like, that conventionally, how do you appear, how does your I appear to you, right? And it's going to appear as if, as he's been saying, it's going to appear in a false manner. Right? It's going to appear as if it's inherently existent. Right? Yeah, and existent from its own side. And what he's saying there is like, he's getting at like a couple of different points, but one is, well, first one is you have to start there, right? And then you have to engage in this ultimate analysis of, does it exist in that way or not? And this particular point now, right, I think what he's getting at is that there's going to be a part of us that wants to say, first of all, there's part of it that wants to say, ultimately, that's real, right? Then if you start analyzing and meditating, and you realize, okay, ultimately that's not real, right? It doesn't, that inherently is an I isn't, that it truly exists an I isn't truly existent, right? That there's going to be a part that's going to say, okay, but conventionally there's really something there. And that will be another form of grasping that will keep you in samsara. That will keep you from actually realizing the ultimate truth. There'll be somewhere, some little tiny part of you will want to hold on to that there's something there from its own side. That's me.
So he's sort of describing a challenge we're going to have to overcome to get where we want to go.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and he's actually been addressing different challenges. Like, so that's one challenge, right? That he's been earlier. He was addressing a challenge, right? That like if you engage in this and you sort of think that you realize, let's say you have some experience where you do have some experience of emptiness, then you might have the challenge of sort of trying to, assert to yourself that emptiness is truly existent, right? That'll be another obstacle. So you have to understand so he's really addressing, when you're approaching this experience of the ultimate truth, that there are a lot of ways you could, because of our beginningless habituation with ignorance, that there are all these subtle ways in which we can deceive ourselves. So one is, you could like have, not yet direct realization, but like if you've had some kind of meditation and you do negate inherent existence and you have some experience of emptiness, then you might start to assert that emptiness is truly existent. Then you're grasping. That's not going to lead you to liberation. You have to understand the emptiness of emptiness. On the other hand, right, you might realize that things don't ultimately exist that way, but then you might try to assert, yeah, but conventionally there's something really there. And that's what he's addressing here. He's saying, if you're doing that, that's a mistaken. He's saying that we have to be satisfied that there merely exists through the power of designation, that there's not something inherently existent from the side of the object, in this case yourself. So he's addressing like subtle ways really here, that one can go wrong. And that's why. So does that make sense? Kind of?
So it's like detours.
Yeah.
Detours that we shouldn't take.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'll point out, because like Nagarjuna says this, right? He says, it's actually quite tricky in a way. Nagarjuna says this point that, one can engage in these different reasonings, reasonings taught by Nagarjuna himself, right? But he sort of says, like, if there's still some little part of you that's grasping at, like, so for example, like, there are people who do that, right? Like, you meditate on like, let's say I'm meditating on the emptiness of myself, right? So, and then I come to some recognition, like I analyze, is that one with the aggregates, is different from the aggregates, and then I find that inherently existent I doesn't exist at all. Right? But then there comes a point in one's practice sometimes where one still grasps at the mind. Like, okay, the I doesn't truly exist, but consciousness, there's a consciousness that's there, that's seeing some rough idea of emptiness, and one sort of starts to grasp that consciousness is really existent. I'm just giving an example, right? And what Nagarjuna is saying is, as long as you're grasping at that, then over time, you're going to reassert, well, I'm that consciousness. Then you're going to assert mine. Then you're going to assert not mine. Then you're going to get angry at, then you're going to get grasping. And so he's saying you have to really, in these subtle ways, get at where are you still grasping? Are you still grasping at emptiness? Are you still grasping at consciousness? Are you still grasping at, and that if if there's some subtle way in which you're still grasping at any of those, then you have, because this is a section on ultimate truth, then you haven't realized the ultimate truth yet. Does that kind of make sense? I think that's part of why he's getting into all these, he gets into a lot of different subtle distinctions, right? He did, like how somebody could assert emptiness is truly established. Here, how somebody could assert that, well, conventionally there's something really there, like consciousness. And so he's just warning, those are mistakes that we can make as we're trying to approach that ultimate, that experience of the ultimate truth. Yeah, and we do, I mean, people do. That's it. I mean, these mistakes are, these subtle mistakes are things that happen for real practitioners, and I think that's also, I just point that out. To me, that's the value of like all these details. If you study like this text and then the Majjhimaka Avatara by Chandrakirti, I mean, there's so many different texts on emptiness. I'll just say that I really think that's the value of all this study of these things, is that then when you go off to meditate, it's like you can identify these points in your own experience, because the real issue is in your own experience in meditation, but that otherwise the danger really, I just want to point that out, because the danger otherwise is, when you're off somewhere just meditating on emptiness in your own room or someplace, that it's, I mean, if you imagine that, right, like a person who, let's say, had some recognition of emptiness and then sort of, I'm just using the example of feeling that emptiness is truly established, right? So they kind of have some subtle assertion that emptiness is real from its own side. From their perspective, that's still a remarkable experience, right? Like, it's not like anything they've experienced before. It's in meditation, right? And there's some feeling of, wow, that's this really amazing thing, emptiness. It's really, like, it would feel remarkable for that person. And if they hadn't studied intensively or extensively on these topics, you can see how the person wouldn't, it wouldn't occur to the person, like they would just think, wow, I'm having this wonderful experience and I feel so much more peace and so much more happiness and so much more joy, which would all be true actually for that person. And so these are guideposts then, where the person can think back and go, well, wait a second, now I'm in the conventional mode, and how am I relating to emptiness? And emptiness is now appearing to me as something truly existent. Does it really exist that way? To ask that question experientially when you're in that state, that's hard, right? But if you studied extensively, and that's what, then the person would ask the question. And if they've already had the previous experience, it won't be that hard to realize, oh, this is also empty, and they'll become liberated, right? Whereas somebody else who hadn't studied that, they could then just think, I'm done. And then they rest in this state for the rest of their life of grasping at something, of an idea of emptiness that's not the ultimate truth, actually, right? That's not an ultimate mind realizing ultimate truth. And they're still happier than they were before, but it's not, they don't achieve liberation, actually. So it's very, I think actually it's very useful to study these things, in order to, actually I'll just share one last reflection, just my own personal reflection on this. I sometimes think that, I sometimes wonder that, I sometimes thought this, if a person were in retreat with a perfect teacher, if you were in retreat with Lama Tsongkhapa, for example, then maybe you wouldn't need that, right? You could just come each day and say, here was my experience today, and then he would say, oh, well, now do this, or oh, you're grasping at that. If you had somebody, then maybe you wouldn't need to know all these things yourself if you were doing the retreat with somebody you could kind of go and describe your experience every day and they would give you feedback. But if we assume we don't have that, then we have to know these things to do it for ourselves, to understand for ourselves introspectively, where am I getting stuck? How am I getting stuck? Am I getting stuck? Do things exist in the way I'm seeing them? And he's getting it very interesting, right? Conventionally, do things exist in the way, I'm perceiving something conventionally in a certain way. Does it even exist that way conventionally? Now I'm perceiving the ultimate this way. But is that really the ultimate, or am I making up an ultimate? That's an approximation, but not really what the ultimate is. So it's that, I think, Yeah, and also that, and you can see how also then, even if well, one is quite difficult, right? How would you have a teacher who would sit there every day, for however long it takes until you, but the other is the teacher would have to know all this then, right? Because they would have to know where somebody else can get, even if they didn't get caught in a certain place, they would have to know, well, where could a student possibly get caught, or where could, and actually, I'll just share one last, I know we're gonna stop, but I'll share one last thing. Even, I mean, I don't have any realization of any of these things, but like, sometimes when I'll talk to people, like, it's really interesting. I mean, from having studied all these things, I'll see, like, I have friends who are meditating, and like, it's fun to talk, like, where some people will say, like, oh, I had this experience. And then you look and you're like, oh, wow, that corresponds to, the personal thing, like, wow, it was remarkable for them, right? And it's good. I mean, it's a positive experience. But if you study it, like, you can go, oh, wow, that's like what's described in such and such, and that's, what's the next thing to do then? Like, that's not the end. What's the next thing to do? And I was like, and you can see, like, the more you know of these things, then the more you can help yourself or somebody else to kind of continue their navigating through that. And if you're with someone like, say, Yumi Kensur Rinpoche, or someone who knows all the different, then you have some, like, it's like you can feel totally safe that you'll know that, what's the right say, right? Like, he'll know for any given person what point you're at and how do you continue. For ourselves, we have to continue, and then sometimes if you get stuck and you don't know, you have to go find that. And that's, actually, I've known people like that who, like, went in retreat, for example, and they made progress, but then, like, if you hit it, like, if you're in a retreat somewhere and you hit a certain plateau where you don't know where your grasping is, then what do you do, actually, right? Like, it's quite difficult, isn't it? If you don't have somebody to ask at that point and you haven't studied it, then you just sort of stay, I guess, at that point until you come across the right text, or you come across a teacher you can ask a question of, or something. And so I think that's a lot of the function of I went on and on. Sorry about that. Does that kind of make sense, though? I think it's very useful, therefore, for a practice perspective. And hopefully, I think I'm the person who, like, makes every mistake. So, like, for me, it's useful to know because I think I've made most of the mistakes. But some people maybe are more efficient, so they don't make all the mistakes, so they can.
But you know what? I'll tell you something. I think that makes a better teacher. Like, experience trumps all. You can relate to people, like, all from all aspects if you do all the mistakes. Because I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. But I could be so relatable to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing. I mean, it sucks going through it and making all the mistakes, but then, like, when people have, like, from different avenues, have different questions, you're like, oh, you can relate to that, and you can be like, hey, this is what I did, or point them in the right direction. And that makes you a better teacher.
That totally makes sense. Oh, we went over. Okay, so we should do a dedication. A supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good.